Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar Data Modeling 101, where we will handle getting started with database modeling. So you start with a problem and we end up with a good database model. So let's get started in a couple of minutes. I see people are still coming in, so welcome, and yeah, let's start in 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Let's get started with this webinar. So during this webinar, we will start with a certain problem, a use case, and we will apply a certain methodology, and we will end up with a database model that solves our problem. Sounds pretty interesting to me. But before we get started, let's have a look at some basic terminology about databases. So just to make sure that we're talking about the same things. So what is actually a database? Well, a database is a well-structured organization or a collection of data. It's structured, and that's the difference between a database and like log files or CSV files that are less structured. Relational databases, well, they have their data structured in tables. And a data model, well, data model defines the structure of the database. So some terminology. If we speak about a database is a collection of data structured in tables. And a table is a single entity of data. And an entity is something that stands on its own. A table has one or, well, mostly not one, has multiple columns or fields, and those are the attributes of the entity. And we also have rows or records, and this is a single instance of the entity. So for example, if we have this table over here, it's a table with information about employees. So what do we have? We have fields like email or name, that's a field, and we have records. For example, Cinda is a single record in this table. What else do we have? We have a primary field, and that's the field that must ensure the uniqueness of each record within the database. And very important is a relation, and you can recognize a relation in Baserow using the plug sign here. This means that this record is related to another record in another table. So that's the basic terminology. Know what a table is? It's an entity of data. Tables have fields and they have records. Okay, let's move on from process to database. So there's a 6-step process here that we will go through, starting with defining the scope. Once we have the scope of the project, we will identify all the entities. Once we have the entities, which are actually the tables of our database, we will check for attributes. Once we have that, we will establish relations between table. And of course, we will create the model, test the model, and as the arrows indicate, it's an iterative process. So it's an illusion to assume that you will be done with your database after a first iteration. You have to go through it again and again, and eventually you end up with a database that works for your use case. So 6 steps that we have to go through. Let's start with the first one, with defining the scope of the project. And actually, that's the largest step. It's also the most important one because everything else you'll be doing will be based on your project scope. So we have 4 sub-steps here to define the scope. The first one is describing the problem, setting goals, identifying stakeholders, and we will write user stories. So let's get started with describing the problem. And describing the problem is something that should be fairly easy. You don't have to write an entire paper about it. You don't have to spend a lot of work in it. It's just in 1 or 2 paragraphs. You have to describe what the problem is and why it is a problem. And I picked a use case for this webinar. It's an organization that currently lacks internal asset management system. So they have all kinds of assets or equipment, office supplies, furniture, kitchen equipment, and so on. And they have a high cost because of the inefficient allocation. They cannot reuse it, and they have unnecessary replacements. So in short, they want to have a system for internal asset management. So that's the first thing. We're describing the problem, the what and the why. Second, we will set clear goals. And that's a very important thing in any kind of project, actually. You need to define 2 things. First of all, you need to say, this is what the project will do, but it's a good idea to make clear what the project will not do. It's also a good idea to write this down. So in our case, the goals of the project, we have 3 goals. First of all, I want to have asset tracking. I want to know which asset is assigned to which employee. So for example, if I have a smartphone or anything as an asset, I want to know which employee is now using this smartphone and the employees that has used it before. That's one of the goals. The second goal is condition monitoring. So if maintenance or replacement is needed, I want to know the condition of each asset. And final goal is the replacement planning. So I like to anticipate on replacements so that I can have a rough budget estimation of how many budget I will need for the replacements. Those are the 3 goals of my project. On the other side, there are a couple of things that are not part of the project, and it's a very good idea to make this clear to stakeholders right from the start. So what we don't want to do with this project is the management of external assets, such as vehicles, because that's with leasing contracts and so on, can become very complicated, total other kind of project. Also, the purchasing process for new assets. So if you want to compare 5 or 6 vendors to see which one is best, this can be a very nice project. It's very useful to do this, but it's not part of our project scope. Just like detailed financial management and having performance reviews for employees. So for an employee, you can see, okay, he has a lot of assets that break, that needs maintenance, but we're not going to implement an entire employee performance review. That's not part of the project. That's not part of our scope. So now we have set clear what the project will do and what the project will not do. We can go to the third sub-step of defining our scope. And this is the identification of the stakeholders. So what is a stakeholder? Well, a stakeholder is everyone who is affected by the project in a direct or an indirect way. In our scenario, well, we have the employees because they need to report issues, requesting replacements. We have IT department that does maintenance and replacement of technical assets. The facilities management department does actually the same for the non-technical assets. The HR department might not be a direct stakeholder, but if they onboard a new employee, well, they have to provide them with all the equipment he needs to perform his job. So they need to see what equipment is available. And then we have the C-level management. They want to have reports to have an overview on which assets needs to be replaced. Okay, so we have also identified the stakeholders. And now one of the more crucial steps is we are going to write user stories. And a user story is a very simple description of a feature of something that needs to be part of the project, written from the perspective of the end user. And it always contains what he wants to do and why he wants to have this feature. So you always use the format as a certain kind of stakeholder. I want to perform an action. I want to do something so that I can achieve a goal. And the so that I can part is very important, because if you cannot fill in so that I can, then actually it's a feature you might not need in your project, because you cannot define a goal, what he must achieve with it. Writing user stories, it actually requires some experience. It requires some practice, but the good thing is we're living in 2024. AI is all over the place, and so are large language models. So if you have some large language model, you can just say, hey, this is my problem scope. Those are the goals of my project. Those are the stakeholders. You know, all the things we have defined in the previous 3 steps. Well, I want you to generate the user stories, and it will not be perfect, but it will offer you already some starting point, and you can start refining them and adding them, removing them where necessary. So I did an attempt to write the user stories of this project, and I came up with, let's do a quick count, 14 user stories. So as you can see, I have my user story here as an employee, as an IT employee, as a facility manager, as an HR employee, and as a manager, or maybe I should have said as a C-level manager. And actually, it's a good idea to maybe do this with Post-its, do this on paper, or use a whiteboard tool so that you quickly can write user stories and rearrange them. It's also a good idea to do this as a team. So sit together with the stakeholders so that each stakeholder can write for himself, okay, as this kind of user, I want to have this kind of application. Okay, I see a question through the chat, and I thought also through the questions. Will the slides be available after the meeting? Yeah, I will try to find a way to make them available. Yeah, so, yep, I'm not sure how we can do it, but we definitely find a way to offer you the slides, eventually sending them by email. So let's go over a couple of the user stories. I'm not going to read them out all 14, otherwise it would take way too long. But for example, as an employee, I want to view all the assets that are assigned to me so that I can keep track of what equipment I currently have. Yeah, maybe for some small things, I just want to know what equipment that I have. Do I have to ask for something? Do I already have it? Someone else, as a facility manager, I want to report issues or damage related to non-technical assets so that necessary repairs or replacements can be arranged. That's something that a facility manager wants to do. From the HR department, I want to view a report of all asset assignments just to ensure that all assets are accounted for and correctly assigned. Okay, so that's for an HR employee, something that he finds important. Okay, we have all the user stories, like I said before. It's not that easy to make all the user stories, but a large language model is a great assistant in this. And this finishes our first step. It's a pretty complex step. It's a pretty hard one. 4 phases. First, describing your problem, setting the goals, identifying stakeholders, and creating your user stories. But once you have this, we can go pretty quick from here. we go to the second step where we identify the entities. So to identify the entities, what I will do is I will select all the nouns from the user stories. I will group them, refine them, combine them, and then I will do a final check if something is really an entity. So let's get started. We select all the nouns from the user stories. And why do I want to select all the nouns? Well, a noun in grammar, it's something that stands on its own in a sentence. And an entity, in the context of a database, it's something that stands on its own in a database. So those are pretty similar. And this means that a noun is very likely to become an entity. And an entity is a table in your database. So if I select all the nouns, then I directly have all my tables, more or less. Because let's have a look at all the user stories, and I have 42 different nouns. I put them all in bold or in blue. So equipment, asset status, state, onboarding, distribution, replacements, those are all nouns. And I put them in a list, so there are 42 nouns. This doesn't mean that we have 42 tables. 42 tables would be way, way, way too much for this project. So let's see what we can do. First of all, the first refinement will be singular and plural. So I have asset, I have assets. I have employee, I have employees. Well, actually, that's the same, so we can combine it. And a good thing is remove the singular version and keep using the plural version, because in the database, we will always write entities as plural, because an entity contains multiple records. You don't have an entity employee, you have an entity employees, because there will be multiple employees. So let's start the cutting. Like I said, I have employee, repair, repairs, asset, assets, replacement, replacements, and report, reports. Okay, let's make a cut, and we already down to 37 more nouns. Let's go to a second iteration of refinement, and we check for synonyms, and synonyms depending on the context of our project. So I have assets, I have equipment, technical asset, non-technical asset. Yeah, actually that's all the same, it's just an asset. I also have asset allocation, asset assignment, distribution, assignments. We all group this under assignments. And I have maintenance and maintenance activities. I group this under maintenance. Issues, disruptions. It's not really the same from a grammar point of view, but in the context of our project, I can say a disruption or an issue, it's more or less the same. And then I have a condition, a state, an asset status. Actually, those are also similar. Replacements, replacement schedule. Let's pick replacements. So you see, we're still cutting nouns, and that's an exercise that you also want to do on a whiteboard, on post-its, on a piece of paper, that you can say, okay, we have the 42 nouns, we put them somewhere on the whiteboard, and let's group them, let's combine them, see what we can take together. And as a final refinement, we will try to make more abstraction to generalize things. And yeah, keep in mind that some subtle differences can be solved by a property, by an additional attribute. For example, employees, facility manager, IT staff member, HR staff member, and manager. Well, actually, those are all employees. And in my employees table, I can have a column that says the job role or the department they are working for. So let's group those under employees. Then we have a lot of assets. Assets, tool, laptops, phones, furniture, kitchen equipment. Well, actually, that's all assets. Repairs and maintenance, let's say it's more or less the same. You can keep them separated, but let's group them here. Okay, this leaves us with, let's count, 5, 6, 10, 12, 12 plus 4 is 16. We still have 16 nouns to go, so we have 16 potential tables, which is already, yeah, a big step from the 42 we had to start with. Now I'm going to check for entity requirements. So, does the noun stand on its own without a lot of additional context? And is it anyway? And maybe that's the first question you need to ask, so you can move the flowchart around on this point. Is it useful to have it as an entity anyway? And that's an important one. Is it a process or an activity that we want to track? So this is my flowchart. First of all, does the noun stand on its own without any additional context? Yes or no? If yes, is it actually useful to have it as an entity? Is it useful to have it as a table? Yes. Okay, you have an entity. No, drop it. You don't need it. If it doesn't stand on its own without a lot of context, the next thing is you need to think, does it describe a process or an activity? Is it something you are doing, like replacements, assignments, and so on? If no, it might be an attribute for another entity. If yes, just, yeah, make sure, do you want to keep track of it? Yes, okay, you have an entity. No, you can drop it. So for the 16 remaining words, let's categorize them. So it stands on its own without a lot of context. Employees, assets, issues. It stands on its own, but actually it doesn't mean anything as an entity. Needs, budget, decisions, life cycle, updates. Though, yeah, those are nouns. They survived all the cuts, but if you think about it, can a life cycle be an entity? Can a life cycle be a table? And a good trick here is to think, okay, let's assume that a life cycle is a table. What are the fields of that table? What attributes does a life cycle have? From, until, yeah, but what else? Maybe an asset, but okay, then I will have one record for each asset. And if I only have one record, does it need to be an entity? But normally you have some feelings about it, like needs, budget. Doesn't feel right to have this as a table. Okay, on the other side, does it describe a process or an activity? No, like asset status and a job. But those can be fields in other tables, like asset status will probably be a field in my assets table. And the job or job role will probably be a field in my employees table. Things you want to keep track of, well, replacements, assignments, and maintenances. So those are the three things I want to track. I want to track all my replacements, I want to track all the assignments, and I want to track all the scheduled maintenances. What I don't want to track is assets procurement and onboarding. And the reason I don't want to track it is, well, let's go back about 15 minutes in time when we say those are the goals, those are not the goals. Onboarding and asset procurement is not part of my project, and that's the reason why I don't want to track them. That's also the reason why, yeah, I actually want to write down, this is project goal, this is not part of the project, to make this kind of decision that it shouldn't be an entity. Okay, this completes our second step. So we started with the project scope. We took all the nouns from the user stories, we grouped them, we refined them, and we come up with, let's have a look, I think 6, yeah, with 6 tables. That's something that we can work with. So we have our entities are our tables. Let's go to the next step, and we are going to determine the attributes. Again, some things that you have to keep in mind. So for each entity, like an employee or an assets or an assignment, you have to think about the useful characteristics, and please do not use more than required. For example, for an employee, we will have the email, the phone number, the names so that we can contact him. Do we need his home address? No. In the context of this application, his salary, it's not useful information, so we're not going to store it. Some other considerations. So if you say life cycle, for example, so let's go back a couple of steps. Decisions, life cycle. If you say, hey, I'm going to take this as an entity, then you will get stuck here on this step, being thinking about characteristics of the entity. So if you can think of any of them, well, the entity is probably not an entity after all. If you see that a lot of attributes are very similar for multiple entities, then you might consider taking them together. So let's take a look at the attributes I came up with. Well, for each of my entities, I use an ID to make sure that I have a primary field that is unique. And for the assets, I have a name, serial number, it's a category, it had a cost, we bought it a certain date, it has a warranty, and so on. It also have a current condition, current user. My employees, only the necessary information. I have my issues. An issue is about an asset. It's reported by someone on a certain date, has a description, it has a priority. And I also have maintenances. And what I said before, if two entities have more or less the same attributes, you might consider grouping them together. So maintenance and issues, if you have a look at it, there is a lot of similarity here. So now you have the choice. You can say, okay, maintenance is actually just a type of issue. So I'm going to put those together and say I have a issue type, and maintenance is just one of the issue types. On the other hand, and that's my personal selection, but hey, if it's your project, do whatever you want. It can work in any way or in both ways. An issue is something that is not expected to happen, while maintenance is something that we expect to happen. So you can schedule maintenance. For example, for a printer, you know that you need maintenance, for example, every 3 weeks or every month. So that's why I think maintenance is different from issues. But in your use case, if you say, hey, we can put this together, then feel free to make it one entity. Okay, a question through the chat. So if the entity is a person, include attributes related to privacy and confidentiality. Yeah. So this is actually the reason why I would encourage you to not store any information that is not required for the project, because what is the use of storing the birthday of someone to store health information, salary information when it goes about asset tracking? So always be careful with storing personal information, or actually any kind of information. Always ask yourself, do I need this information for my project? So yeah, we have 6 entities and we have a lot of attributes. So we have determined the attributes. Great, we can move on to the next step. And the next step is establishing relationships between my tables. So what is a relationship? That actually it's an attribute from one entity that refers to an attribute of a second entity. Yep. Yeah, question through the chat. What are we building? Yep, it was in the beginning of the presentation. We are building a internal asset management system. So an organization has a lot of assets, office equipment, furniture, and so on, and we want to manage all those assets. We want to know which assets belong to which employee and when they need maintenance. Okay, you're welcome. So relationships. An attribute of one entity refers to an attribute of a second entity. So for example, the current user of the assets refers to the employee entity. So let's go over all the attributes and see which one are relations. And some theoretical background about relations. Actually, you have two kinds. You have a has a relationship, and that's the one that occurs most in relational databases. So for example, a project has an owner. There's a relation between project and owner. And they can be one-to-many or many-to-many. For example, a project has multiple tasks, but a task belongs to a single project. Or in our case, an employee has multiple assets, but an asset belongs to one employee. Except if it's a shared asset, then an employee has multiple assets, but the asset belongs to multiple employees. And then we have the many-to-many relationships. Just for information, there's also a relationship for a hierarchy. For example, a car is a vehicle, an employee is a person, and so on. But let's have a look at our relationship. So if I go to the assets table, I have the current user. Current user is referring to the employees table. Employees have assets, referring to the assets table. Issues is about an asset, referring to the assets table, is reported by an employee, is assigned to an employee. And as you can see, actually all relations go to an asset or an employee. So those are really the core entities of our database. So also for replacements, we are replacing one asset by another asset, and there's an approver being an employee for that replacement. So now we have our entities, we have attributes, we have relations, we are ready to create a model. So this is a step where we get our hands dirty and we start creating a database. So that's also the part where Baserow as a database platform gets involved. So my advice is, first of all, create all the tables, because once you have all the tables, well, then you can make relations between the tables. You cannot make a relation if a table does not exist. And think about your data types. Which attributes will be text, which will be numbers, which will be dates, and so on. And we have the link to the link to table field for relationships. So if I go to Baserow and I create a new database, just for demo purposes, and I say, okay, my first table is the assets table. The second one is my employees table. And now I can start creating attributes. So the first one is my ID, will be a single line of text. An asset also have a purchase date, will be of the type date. It will come with a certain cost. And cost is of the type number. And an asset is assigned to an employee. And this is the link to table field. So where I can say, okay, I have an employee. And by default in Baserow, you create a relation in two ways. So I create a related field to the linked table. In other words, asset will have an employee field, but the employees automatically get an asset field. So in this way, you create your entire database structure. So you have the entities, you have the attributes, just create them, use the appropriate data type. And to have some test data, again, a large language model can be very easy. Just say, okay, I want a CSV file with 10 or 20 demo records, and those are the fields that must be in the CSV file. And once you have this in Baserow, simply import file, you can import the CSV file, and you have all your data. Like for example, over here, I created my initial database, the V1. I have my assets. So this is a CSV that I imported. An ID, a name, serial number, they are in a category, have a cost, and so on. They have a current user being my employee. You see that here I have two current users. Assets can have issues, so issues that are being reported. Assets are assigned to an employee. They can have maintenance. So for example, this one, it has a maintenance cleaning scheduled on this date, performed by this employee, status is completed, and cost was 30 euros, $30, whatever currency you want, because it's just test data. And we also have replacements. So this asset is replaced by replacement 001, and it's replaced by this asset. Yep. So what I actually done here in V1 is just looking at what I created. Those are the entities, those are the attributes, and I just generated my database and added some test data to it. Okay, so we have been checking the relationships, so relation between assets and employees. And what I will do is offer them a proper name, because in my initial database here, I have a link issues, and then I have issues assigned to, and I also have in assets replacements and replacements new asset. Those names are not 100% clear. So I created a V2 where I say, okay, assets, those are the issues, replacement by the new asset. And for my employees, I have clarified that issues are the assigned issues. So those are the things that you must solve. And you have the reported issues. Those are the things that you just have reported, but you don't have to solve them. Yeah. So I added more clear naming to all of my tables. Okay, I already have a nice database with some test data in it. Yeah, and also check singular and plural when appropriate. So replacements, an asset will only be replaced one. Well, pick a singular name replacement. It will be much easier to read for the user. Okay, creating the model was not that hard. Now we're gonna test the model. And to test the model, well, what we need to test is if it actually meets our requirements. So let's go back to the first step where we have written the user stories, and let's have a check if it meets all the user stories. Also, we need to check, are there any other issues, and maybe it will just get you new requirements. So first of all, does it meet the current requirements? And the current requirements are the 14 user stories that we have defined. So we go back to the first step and we're gonna check them all. Okay, maybe it will not solve the user story 100% because you need a form to input something. Well, this can be solved using a view. Major focus here is the data model I have. Does it solve my problem? Does it support the user story? So the 14 user stories, I went through all of them and I detected 5 user stories that are not completed. For example, tracking the replacement schedule for non-technical assets, also assigning assets to employees, reviewing condition, and an employee that wants to see all his assets. This was not directly possible. This user story was not solved. And the reason for this one is that I don't have an overview of the current assets because I only have all my assignments. So if I go back to my V2 database, I see all my assets, but actually this is a link to the assets table. So those are all the assets that are somehow ever were assigned to me, not my current assets. The same here for assignments. I don't know if asset number 19, is it still assigned to me or did I turn it in? Well, actually I can know this, but I have to open it. check the start date. There's no end date, so it will probably be still in my possession. But it requires an additional click, and we don't want this. So we have to solve it. Requesting replacements, tracking replacement schedule. The problem here is that I don't have any fields or functionality to request a replacement. So if I have a look at my table replacements, it says, okay, asset 1 is replaced by asset 2 on this date, approved by this employee for this motivation. But I don't have the opportunity as an employee to say, hey, I want to, for example, this headset is broken. I want to order a new headset. I don't have a functionality to request a replacement. So that's something that I want. Assigning assets to employees, it's not clear which assets are available and which are occupied. If I check my assets table, I can see a current user. I can see a lot of assignments, but is the assignment still active? Has it been returned? I don't know it yet. And over here for the management, there's at the moment no budget information for replacement. So we also have to fix this. So those issues means that we have to fix something. It doesn't mean that we have to start from scratch, that we have to start all over again. No, we just need to fix those issues. And I checked how we can fix them. And this requires some Baserow knowledge because most of those issues will be solved by adding a formula field, adding roll-up fields, and so on. So I don't have an overview of my current assets, only of the assignments that ever were made and maybe are expired. Well, in my employees table, I will add a formula field that will filter the assignments and only show the ones that don't have an end date. So let's go to version number 3, employees table, and I added the field active assignments. And what I'm actually doing here is looking at my assignments table where I say, okay, for the assignment, the end date must be empty. So I have my assignments over here. All those for a certain employee where the end date is empty, well, those are active assignments. So if you now want to know as an employee, what equipment do you have? Which assets do you have? Well, they are in this field. So problem has been solved. For my replacement, well, solutions can be pretty simple. It doesn't always involve creating formulas and so on. Sometimes it involves adding new fields. So I want to make a request for a replacement. Well, I added the field to my employee table. It's a requester. He filed the request on a certain date. My request has a certain status. So waiting for approval. It has been replaced, has been rejected or approved with a motivation. And then once it's approved, it has the approver signature and the replacement date. If it's been rejected, well, those fields will not be filled in. And I can adjust the motivation or add another field, rejection motivation, for example. So the user story was not completed, but we didn't have to think all over again how we will structure the database. We just needed to add a couple of additional fields. Also for this one, so which assets are available or not? Well, the current user, it should be empty if the asset is no longer occupied. So in my asset table, I have my employees over here, but this doesn't tell me anything about if it's actively used by the employee. It's solved by my current user field, where again, I do a lookup in my assignment table. And I say, okay, if the end date is empty, then it's still in use for this employee. So now I have my current user. Okay, so if I check again, it covers all my user stories. I should be happy. But I'm not completely happy because there's something that I feel that doesn't feel right. There's some issue that I think, okay, we made a mistake here when developing the model. And that's very common. You will definitely make mistakes, especially in the first iteration. A question, can AI be used to help writing the formulas? Yes. Well, at Baserow, we also invest in AI. And there is a field over here. It's not configured on my instance over here. It's the AI prompt. But if you check on baserow.io, there you have the AI fields already configured for you. And you can actually type, I want a formula that filters all the active assignments for the employees. So yeah, we can definitely offer AI assistance for formulas. And the most recent version also have AI assistants to read the content of documents in the database and summarize them. Yes. I don't want to take this too far for everything that has to do with AI, but let's have a look at my settings over here. No, it's not in my settings. Yeah, I need to check, but you can configure your own AI model, or you can use your own AI model inside Baserow. If you check the YouTube channel, we have a video about that that shows how you can configure this field. Okay, so there was one thing that I'm not really happy about. Are there any other issues? Yeah, a couple of them. For example, I don't find it very readable to say that EMP002 has asset AS004. I want to make it more readable. And I can do this by adding lookup fields. So if I check version 4 in my assignments table, I have added a lookup field asset name and employee name. So now I know that EMP002 is Jane Smith, which tells me much more than EMP002. And I know that asset AS006 is a MacBook Pro 14-inch. Okay, this solves my problem because I adjust my formula here a little bit. And now I see current user is Jane Smith because I'm no longer asking for the ID, but here for the employee name. And in the employees table, I'm asking for the asset name. Yeah. So this offers me a much more readable text. There's another thing that really bothers me. It's something that's simply not right in our database model. So I told you it's an iterative process. So sometimes you have to go back a couple of steps, and it's the relation between assets and employees. So let's go back in time a little bit. We are establishing relationships. And I said, okay, an asset has a current user, which is an employee, and an employee has multiple assets. So I create this link. But by implementing the database, and this is just learning by doing, it's because we implemented the database that we now see that actually the current user comes from the assignment table instead of the employees table. So let's redefine our relations. Namely, the current user, I get them from the assignment table. You see this in the formula. I'm referring to the table assignment to get my current user. And the same for asset. I'm not referring directly to the asset table. I'm referring to the assignments table. And this is also something that I fixed here in this version. So in my assets table, I no longer have my employee because the employees link wasn't telling me anything. The only thing I want to know is who is my current user. And this information is coming from the assignments table. It's not coming from the employee table. Yep. So that's a change I made in my database model. I removed the employees here and I removed the assets here because actually it's just the assignments that are of my interest. Okay, so let's see where we are. Have we detected any new requirements? At the moment, not, but well, you definitely will have new requirements once the project evolves. So if you detect new requirements, write a user story about it, check the nouns in the user story. Is there something that needs to be an additional field? Does it introduces a new relationship? And you change your model if it requires to be changed. Sometimes a lot of things can be solved by just adding a field to an existing entity. Other things will have a much bigger impact and require a complete review of your model. And no, we haven't detected any new requirements at the moment, but be sure projects, databases, those things are actually alive. So they will need to change at some point. Okay, so we completed our 6 steps. We defined the scope, identified the entities, we determined the attributes, checked for relationships, created the model, we tested the model, did a couple of iterations, and now we can actually finalize it. So for example, by adding views. So in Baserow, you can add all kinds of views. So I have all my assignments. I can group them by asset. I can also group them by employee. I can filter them so that I only see the active assignments. For assets itself, we have a lot of single select fields here, so Kanban is very useful. I can even drag them from one field to another. And we also have forms, so I can create a form view, add new asset, and I can add all the fields over here, preview it, and this allows me to quickly add a new asset, or I can do it on the replacement table and request for a new replacement. So actually what we have here is a pretty functional database. So in summary, some key points. First of all, know your processes, know your problem, know what you want to solve with your project, because it's actually the foundation of any other step. Also, only store the data that is necessary for the process. Like I said, don't start to store health information, salary information about employees, just to know which pen they are using. Large language models, great assistants. Please put them in the cockpit, let them assist you, but don't let them take over the project. So don't write your problem description and rely 100% on what is generated, but use it as your co-pilot, as your smart assistant. Also, do not overanalyze everything. The mistake I've made with the relation between assets, employees, that it goes over assignments. Actually, if you're not an experienced database designer, the only way you will detect this is by creating the model and testing the model. So spend a lot of time on analyzing what you want, spend a lot of time on writing user stories, but don't spend too much time on determining, should it be an attribute, yes or no? Do we have a relationship here? Just create your model, test your model, and go to the next iteration to improve it. And that's the final key point. You will need multiple iterations. You will need multiple tests to get your database model up to date and usable for your application. Okay, some more resources. Well, actually, everything is available through Baserow.io. We have API documentation. We have a great community, community.baserow.io, where you can put all your questions. A lot of articles in the knowledge base. We have a lot of templates available, tutorials on the YouTube channel, and so on. So be sure to check them out. I see that we still have a couple of questions in the chat, so let's take a moment to go over the questions. Yes, you can link different tables. Yeah, so situations where tables are linked to each other is if you have, so let's scroll back a little bit. Yeah, so if you have an attribute in one table and you see that this attribute, the data type, like asset, it won't be pure text, that it refers to another table, then you have a relationship. Another question, can we have doubles in the ID field? Just the text. You can have actually anything in the field. So let's go back to my demo. A demo table in a demo database, terrible ID if it comes to naming convention, but okay. So I can set the data type here. I can set it to number, decimal places, for example, 2, and I can put 1.23, 5.43, and so on. So actually you can have almost any kind of a data type as the primary key. Okay, so yeah, we are done with the webinar. I hope you found it educational, that it really will help you to creating databases for your next project. So just remember, 6-step process. Start with identifying all your needs, building or detecting your entities, and just create your database and get started with it until you end up with a good working model. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar and see you on one of our later webinars.